Hello, students, and welcome to today's lecture with me, Professor William Wright, going over Chapter 21 on the Modern World. This is from Mark Getlein's Living with Art, our textbook. And FYI, I'm recording up at our shop and studio in Decatur, so you will probably hear some oversized trucks with loud exhausts go by. I'm just going to power through that. But in any case, yes, let me go ahead and start sharing. This will be part one of this. This looks weird. Okay, it is good. It was kind of distorted for a second, but okay, yeah. Starting on chapter 21, the modern world, basically we're stepping in at around 1800, around the beginning of the 19th century. We are starting this chapter. The 19th century, it begins, artists and writers recognize that their time is something new and something different, and they decide to call it modern. They kind of notice that things are different at this time. Modernity reflected the emergence of a new kind of society in the wake of three revolutions, which we talked about at the end of the last chapter. That was the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution. Driven by technological progress and characterized by rapid change, this century gives birth to our industrialized middle class and a new culture of mass production, mass advertising, and mass consumption. This includes the mass consumption of leisure activities like shopping, entertainment, and visiting art museums. Okay, so what's really key here is technological progress and industrialization leads to factories, leads to factory jobs, leads to industrial jobs, and this means that there is this middle class that appears from history prior to this is mostly the peasants, the regular people, and then the rich people, the aristocrats. But now we have a new kind of in-between type of social status, which is the middle class, right? There's less stratification and more, well, I guess, yeah, we're getting more sections in cultural, hierarchy. But in any case, yes, this new consumption of goods as well as activities changes a lot in the art world, okay? And one of the big things is that we start to see art become more common in everyday life, right? In these times in the 19th century, art museums become a new development, and the first national art museum is begun in the Louvre in Paris. We talked about that, talking about the salons back in the Rococo kind of era, and it's in 1793 the Louvre opens, and this is considered the first national art museum. Art that had belonged to the aristocrats and royals and the church and all those folks was now something that all people could take part in. Now, of course, the ancient people could go see art in public spaces like churches and things like that, but now actual, those rock star artists have come along, and art is now like a precious material. And in the 19th century, regular people get to take part in that. Okay, now another big development that comes to the art world because of industrialization is a specific tool that radically changes how artists work in the 1800s and from there on. It totally changes the entire world of art, and I'm trying to set you guys up. I hope you remember what tool it was that changed everything in the mid 1800s for the art world. I'm kind of giving you a second to think about it. Do you know what it is? It was the camera, right? We had a whole chapter on this, and we talked about it in the, I think, chapter 2 at one point. But it's really, it can't be overstated how important it was, the development of camera to artists at this time. So, well, and from here on. So from the Chauvet Cave paintings of 30,000 BC and whatever came before that, until the first successful daguerreotype in 1837, images had always been made by hand. For the first time ever, we have images that can be created by a machine. The camera poses profound questions about the nature and purpose of art, even as it opened up the new possibilities for the art world. Remember, we talked about before, artists, on the one hand, they lose a job in the portraiture, in landscape painting, in these sort of practical everyday uses of the ability to recreate an image of the world that's around you, they lose that job because that job can now be done by the machine of the camera. However, it also, if looked at in another way, opens up this idea that, like, well, artists now, that whole part of the artist job that's about creativity and innovation, well, that's going to become more and more important, because now, rather than, you can go get a portrait made by a camera, but if you want an artistic portrait, if you want an artistic depiction of a landscape, if you want an artistic depiction of a mythical figure, now artists are kind of allowed to be more creative and more innovative in their approach, right? So in some ways it frees up artists, in some ways it takes a job away from the artist, or it just adds some new layers of complexity. Okay, and then of course, by the time we get to the 20th century, as we talked about in the photography department, we have film develop, or in the photography chapter, we have film develop, and we have artist photographers develop, in terms of how they document the world. And that really changes the role of the photographer as an artist as well. So all very cool, very important. So remember these things. Now, in any case, getting back on track to kind of the art as we were looking at it at the end of the 1700s, we have, there was the Baroque and the Rococo, and by the time you get through the Rococo, it's kind of silly and frilly and very emotional and loose, and the Neoclassical develops as this sort of answer to that. So the Rococo, that loose kind of hazy look, it also lends itself to that genre painting, those paintings that occasionally happen of just like everyday people, everyday landscapes, everyday scenes. That all kind of is one side of the art world, and the other side is this neoclassical world that it's kind of, in a way, it begins as just a way of kind of looking back at, again, Greek and Roman art, but it also, in the French world, in the late 1700s, it becomes political in a way. So Jacques-Louis David, who's kind of the poster child of neoclassicism, he's painting very political art. He's painting about Marat, that anti-monarchist who was murdered by another anti-monarchist. He's painting Napoleon. This neoclassicism kind of tends to be almost revolutionary in its who's making it and who's it is connected to. While the Romantic genre painting, they kind of try to tie that into monarchists. Remember, tying in that simple everyday painting of monarchs kind of leads to problems for the monarchs, and they end up beheaded and stuff. So in any case, that's not really a full-fledged movement, but that's just something we kind of notice in neoclassicism. But talking about neoclassicism in more depth, remember, it's kind of about mythology. It's a return, even, like I said, once again, to Greek and Roman ideals, Greek and Roman order, and the mythos and legends around them. But Aang is the name, and I know it looks weird because it looks like Ingress, but Jean-Auguste Dominique Aang is his name. I'm sure I still said it wrong, but in any case, his as a student of Jacques-Louis David, the neoclassicist, Aang is all about ideal form, careful compositional structure, clean contour, clean color, and precise draftsmanship. It's very ordered. It's very I would say restrained. I wouldn't call it restrained, but it's really tight. I guess that's what I would say. It's all about, it's so perfect, it's almost not even real. It's just too perfect. These drapes, this woman's back here and her skin, it's just, and even Zeus's skin over here, I guess Jupiter, his skin is just sort of it's so real, it's unreal, right? And the colors are bright and overwrought. It's almost like mannerism, in the very long torsos that it has. But in any case, this is neoclassical taste as of the early 19th century. Aang had inherited the view that great art must be made from great subject matter, and that the greatest subject matter of all was history, right? So that's feeding into that whole neoclassical idea of looking at historical art. And so Aang is kind of, he helps us transition to neoclassicism. I would say it's like a little bit less political, but still very much that kind of over tight academic art side of the art world right now. Now, there is an answer to neoclassicism. So neoclassicism is this late 18th, early 19th century, refers back to the Greek and Roman style. It's all about order, clarity, and restraint. Romanticism develops as the second dominating strength. So remember, I talked about before that after the Renaissance, there's always, pretty much from here on out, at least like two different strains of art, and it's pretty much the classical academic art world versus the like kind of freewheeling like innovative, creative, I guess, like liberal art world, I guess you might say. But in any case, they change. They swap back and forth the styles that they favor at any given time, but it's usually academic versus, counterculture, maybe, I guess you could say. But in any case, Romanticism is the second trend. That's opposite of the neoclassical academic side. It's generally assumed to be opposite of neoclassical. Romantic works are marked by a more intense color, turbulent emotions, complex compositions, more soft outlines, drama, and heroic. So they both do drama. They both do heroic subject matter, although neoclassicism is more Greek and Roman. And although it does have the modern political people, although then in neoclassicism, modern political people are very like tight and stuffy. But in Romanticism, it's still big and heroic, but I think it's a little bit less mythological and more, I guess it is mythological, but it's more everyday heroic in some ways. But in any case, it's often considered a revival of styles, which is funny because neoclassicism is also a revival of styles. I guess Romanticism is a revival of that looseness that we saw in Rococo and genre painting, right? It's kind of Rembrandt-esque in the way that it's very soft, or maybe even Rubenesque in the way that the figures, it's so soft, it's not really clean, it's not really tight. The colors tend to blur, and yeah, the composition is just more like I'd say freewheeling or something. I don't know. It's just not so tight. But in any case, Romanticism also, they both kind of have, but Romanticism especially has some monumental artworks associated with it. It's kind of about bigness and heroicism, although it's kind of not about the same level of heroicism as, the Greek gods and stuff like that. But these are more like liberty and like stories of just stories of heroism from cultural tales and things like that. But in any case, now this one here is Eugene Delacroix. He's, again, Romanticism still, I guess most of the art world is just kind of getting behind revolution and the exciting advancement of society. And Delacroix, liberty leading the people, that's a very revolutionary piece. It's almost Les Miserables-esque in its, liberty is carrying the flag and leading forth the charge, in this like aggressive emotional scene that's, again, it's sort of loose. This is not very neoclassical. It's all hazy and loose. I'd say Géricault's almost neoclassical. It is very tight and very, everybody's got a tight musculature and stuff, but we've already looked at the way that he lays out shapes, and it's very organized, which is kind of classical, but at the same time, it's got that more loose emotional feel than, it's more emotional than neoclassicism. But in any case, they're both very big, very large pieces. It's kind of something that happens in the 18th century. But another figure we need to see and look at in Romanticism is Goya, who is well known. This is Jupiter eating his children, and this is a very, I don't know, emotional, I would say turbulent, yes, depiction of that scene. It's I guess you would say it's almost more real in a way, more it's depicted in a more relatable way, or just more graphic in its nature, that literally a man like kind of what it would look like, this like scary person eating his children. And it's, we know that the story goes and the children come back and all stuff, but it's still a very gruesome idea. He's ripping apart this, and that's just sort of, it's always been such a creepy piece, but it's like interesting because it's mythological, so it ties to neoclassicism, but it's so loose. It's like, it's really the appearance that makes them so different from each other, and it's just sublime. Remember that word? Or it's like ugly beauty. It's an awesome piece. It tells a story. It makes us feel a lot, but it's not attractive to look at. And that's the way most of Goya is. We see the executions on the 3rd of May. We've looked at this one before. We see the hazy looseness, the emphasis, the subordination, but really it's about a dramatic telling of this emotional story of the dissenters, people who didn't agree with the Spanish government, being killed. And then also during the Disasters of War series, he did a series of prints of just people basically being tortured. This man's being sawed in half, and it's a pretty horrible scene there. Saturn devouring, I said Jupiter earlier, I apologize. It's Saturn devouring his children. I always get those mythos characters mixed up. But in any case, also important to note is this sort of loose, airy, like, I guess, romantic depiction of a nude figure that it's, again, it's kind of heroic in nature. But I guess I do want to point out that it's compared to, we look at this piece here in the bottom right, compared to the Grand Odalisque by Eng. This is not a very like sexualized character. It's very legendary, mythological, I would say, compared to Goya's depiction here is kind of a more erotic, dream-like scene. I would say. I mean, and I hesitate to use those words a whole lot, but there is a shift in that depiction of the nude, and that's important because of something we're going to talk about in a future, just a couple slides, really. But in any case, now after the development of neoclassicism and romanticism, we're just going to look at a whole series of different movements that sort of like stack up against each other. And mostly we're kind of looking at what I would call, I guess, the countercultural or the more avant-garde movements, because in the background, that neoclassical movement just sort of lasts for a long time. Neoclassical and actually romantic gets kind of pulled into that. Those are the academic styles. These are the more advancing styles that are reacting to those innovations of the camera and industrialization and all that stuff. But in any case, in the development of the middle class, all that stuff. But looking at these three, each one has its own set of slides where we repeat this. So if you want to pause it and write it down in this, or, I'm not going to read it because I'm going to read each one of these as we look at the slides. But we are going to look at realism, impressionism, and post-impressionism first. But then we have a whole series of these where it shows you several we're going to look at, and then we look at the slides and all that. But, really pay attention to the blue words and when we get to the slides. But in any case, Gustave Courbet is one of the first artists that we look at as a realist artist, a realism artist. There's a movement called realism. It's broadly any art in which the goal is to portray forms in the natural world in a highly faithful manner. But that's not all there is to it. That's naturalism in making things look real. But specifically in the 19th century, as identified with the artist Courbet, it fosters the idea that everyday people and events are fit subjects for important art, rather than it always having to be heroic or exotic. So this is coming off of that Northern European tradition of genre painting, of landscape painting, of scenes of regular people. And it's said that it's all started because Courbet was traveling in Ornans and saw this funeral for a guy that he didn't know who it was. All these characters obviously are connected in some way, but they're just sort of, some of them have clout in the community, like the priest and some of the clergy figures. But for the most part, these are all people that nobody would know other than, each other. They, in the community, they would know each other. But overall, the broader world doesn't know these people. And so by painting them, as we've already seen other people do, but making it such an intentional thing to paint people that nobody knew, and it's not even an allegory for other things in life or a broader idea of society. It's literally just paintings of a scene that's happening. That's a big deal, and that becomes realism. So here he also has this painting of his studio, a real allegory, right? Which is basically because he's painting a painting of an allegory, and everybody's sort of set up and like how he's studying them, and he's going to depict them in the painting, and yet it's like it's in real life. It's the real version of the allegory, but it's not because, they're just portraying the characters. But anyways, it's very cool. And it's just this idea of everyday people and events being good enough to paint, and they don't have to be heroic. Now, I think it takes its style from romanticism, maybe a little bit more than neoclassicism, but not entirely. It's its own thing. But it's the subject matter that makes it important. But they are trying to paint things naturalistically. We have Rosa Bonheur, who's very naturalistic in a way, although these horses, they're so brightly lit up that they're not like super real looking. But this painting of this field being plowed it's amazing how naturalistic it is. But the point of the picture is that it's just cows plowing a field, or, oxen, I guess they might say, plowing this field. Right, that's what's important. It's these horses being kind of wrangled and rustled here in this scene above. It's just regular people doing regular work, right? That's what's important. And Rosa Bonheur is a big contributor to that. And then we get into some other characters. Realism does begin to get some clout. And Edouard Manet is a very well-known realistic painter. Realism painter. But now note later, we're going to talk about Monet. They are different people. Manet and Monet, it's very, and I can't remember Monet, Claude Monet is his name. Edouard Manet is the realist painter. He's working a little earlier than Monet, although they are very close to contemporary. But note here, 1863, so this is well after the invention of the camera. Artists are really getting into a little bit already by this stage the idea of painting things with some artistic bent to them and stuff like that, things that wouldn't normally be photographed. And that's what we have here. But what's worth noting about this piece that really makes a splash in the world is that while he's just a regular realist painter, in the idea that, here we're just looking at a scene of people having lunch, this particular scene, choosing to depict this scene becomes really controversial. And there's a few reasons. Number one, right out of the gate, the academic world comes at him because, it is the kind of looser style. And the figure in the back, technically, if she stood up, she'd be like 9 feet tall, and that's not very accurate. People are very upset about that in the kind of stuffy academic way. But there's also, and more importantly, a couple other things. Number one, this is a depiction of a nude woman who is not mythological. This is not a character from legend, and she's not representative of some legend. She's just a regular person, right? She's not representative of an allegory. She's not representative of, nymphs frolicking while the poet plays his lute. It's just a woman, a regular woman from real life sitting there. And there's two other things. Number one, she's looking right at us, right? That's a very disconcerting thing. But in addition to her not being heroic in any way and looking right at us, she's also hanging out with some regular men. Once again, these are not, they're middle-class men, maybe upper middle class, but they're not mythological figures. They're not aristocrats. They're not representative of aristocrats. They are bankers, right? And so it's really clear from this scene, they're clothed, she is not. What's about to happen is probably, it's a scene of prostitution potentially, or it's seen as that. And the fact that this is a scene of just regular people in a scene of possible sexual conquest, it just becomes really, it freaks out the public, right? And or at least the art public. And what it leads to is this piece, when it is submitted to the Salon, the 63 Salon, Manet gets rejected. So then he exhibits it actually in another salon. They changed the title to Le Bon, and they put it in what's called the Salon of Refusals, which is initiated the same year. He's part of the very first inaugural show of basically like the anti-art get together, right? It's not the Salon, which is the academic, big splash, trendy art people. They say, no, it's too controversial, it's too bad. And it gets sent off to the Salon of Refusal. Basically, Napoleon III says, like, hey, throw it in here. And it becomes this principal attraction. It actually ends up getting more people go to the Salon of Refusals than the traditional salon so that they can see this particular piece. And it generates both laughter and scandal. It's just like, it's a big deal. And again, I think it may have even been that these people were known in the community as regular people. It's just like a big deal. And I'm paraphrasing, and there's probably some details that we could get into and talk more about. But what's really key too is that when Manet talked about making this piece, he was just thinking back to, we looked at the Titian painting of, and it's kind of the one I was referring to, of the men of, Venetian aristocracy frolicking and playing the lute with the women. And these are just vague metaphors for things that people are doing at the time. But it's just, it's the same scene, but it's not regular people, right? And it's so, but that's what he's kind of referring back to. He's actually pulling from historical painting, right? He also even pulls from this painting, which right now I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember the name of, but there's this whole tradition of specifically, this figure here, the way that he's sitting, Manet even points out, like, look, I'm looking at these older pieces, and the way that this figure in this whole grouping here is modeled, or the grouping in the Lunch in the Garden is modeled after this grouping here in this print, and these are mythological historical figures, and it's totally okay for them to be depicted in this way here. But when Manet does it, it's not cool, right? It's a direct pull from the same scene, and even everybody's nude in this scene, but it's just this idea of the scandalous nature of putting regular people in it. Okay, so in any case, this is where realism really makes a big splash. And it's ironic because in the Salon 63, the traditional salon, William Bouguereau, Adolphe William Bouguereau, a great painter, he's doing this sort of neoclassical, like mannerist or romantic. I think he's kind of a mixture of romantic and neoclassical, but he's like the poster child. Everybody loves him. He like wins. He's a big hit. And look at how much nudity and like kind of restrained sexuality is in these pieces, right? It's a lot of skin, it's a lot of dreamy kind of softness going on here, and this is totally okay while everybody is like hating on mayonnaise, right? So it's kind of this silly thing to point out, like I guess because these are just representative of ideas, right? These are just paintings of, little baby angels and falling in love with an angel and things like that. They're so mythological in nature. It's okay for them to be so explicit, I guess you might say, compared to Manet, because they're regular people, it's not cool anymore. Anyway, he takes this and he's cool with it. He goes with it. He ends up painting another painting that actually becomes almost more controversial. After the Luncheon on the Grass sparks all the controversy in 63, he paints this painting of Olympia, and it creates an even bigger uproar in 65. And he gets into the regular salon, and it's, again, very upsetting to people. Conservatives condemn the work, and it's, again, because this is a regular person. And I think I can't remember if it was a model or an actual prostitute that he gets to pose, but it's a regular person. It's not a mythological in nature. She's not a politician. She's not a hero. She's just a regular person. And so it's immoral. It's vulgar. The journalist Antonin Proust later recalls, if the canvas of Olympia was not destroyed, it is only because of the precautions that were taken by the administration, right? And this piece, it's amazing. It's so subtle, it's not terribly explicit, and especially when you compare it to some of the pieces in art history that we've looked at already in this class. It's like this was only made a little bit before this, the statue of Canova as Venus, or by Canova of Borghese as Venus. But in any case, I don't know. There's not the dramatic mythological story. She's not, sleeping in this like pastoral scene. She's in her house. The servant is like a more realistic depiction of the servants they would have had in the early 1800s, right? And this is all very upsetting to the academic world at the time. And it's just funny because at the end of the day, visually, it's not much different than what we've seen before. Even the positions of the hands and things like that, it's been seen before. And yet when Manet does it, it's very upsetting. In any case, after realism kind of, makes a big splash as this new art of everyday and things like that, there are some new movements that, again, they're developing even more so out of the idea that the artist now gets to give their interpretation, their perspective. And out of the realists comes the Impressionists. It's a movement in painting originating in 1960s in France. It arose in opposition to the academic art of the day. In terms of subject matter, Impressionism follows realism in portraying everyday life, especially leisure activities in the middle class. Landscape is a favorite subject, and they have a new practice of painting actually outdoors. In technique, the Impressionists favor alla prima, which is direct painting. They don't do an underpainting or anything like that. They just like get the paint and they start painting the scene. It's broken color. It's usually very thick. It's unblended. It just sits on, colors sit on top of each other. But in any case, they were all put into the service of recording, this is important, the fleeting effects of nature and the rapidly changing urban scene. Essentially, Impressionists, they actually get their name because a lot of them are friends with Manet, and Manet gives them the name of the Impressionists. And the whole idea is that they're giving an impression of any given moment, right? They're just working quickly. They take their paint, they pack it out. This is like the guys you see. They go to the pond and they make sure they're going to paint it all at sunset. Before the sun goes down, they're going to completely finish this painting of the pond at sunset. So that means they have to go quickly. If they want to paint the guy going by on his boat, he's only going to be there for a few seconds. So they got to do it real fast. So they got to just give an impression of the scene. I like to think of them as like memories. If you close your eyes and think of like a memory or a dream, it's always kind of loose, like you can see it, but you don't see it really cleanly. The edges are off, the colors aren't exact, because some of the colors are really bold and stand out. I love to think of it like that. And the Impressionists, really become one of my favorite movements, and some of the late romantics are already doing things like this, but the impressionists really take it. And the whole thing is that they're not thinking uh, about the stories behind it. They're almost unemotional in nature, right? So yeah, Manet calls them, the impressionists. They're just painting the impression of the moment. They're painting directly. They're not making a lot of plans. They're just taking things out to see the scene. Monet, as I said, Claude Monet, he's kind of like, again, he's the poster child for Impressionism. He's the guy. If we look at this painting, we know what's water, we know what's tree, we know what's city, we know what's reflection of tree, we know what's ripple of water. We know all this, even though at the end of the day, it's just kind of mushy paint, right? He just uses some subtle value changes, some subtle contrast, a little bit of clean line every now and then. But overall, if you look real close, you get up close to those clouds. If I were to zoom in, it would just look like a smudge of paint. If I were to zoom into this little turquoise ripple right here on this red, it would just look like a little bit of blue right in the middle of that orange, or a little bit of turquoise in the middle of that orange. And it would just look like smeared paint. But when you step back, when the colors optically mix together, your eye catches all of this together, especially like if you squint, it all comes together and we recognize it, right? So it's pretty much like the least amount of information that a painter could give, and you still see it. It's also gives rise to something we call painterly, right? And painterly is a broad term, but the Impressionists really show it the most. It's basically where you see the paint. The painter is not trying to hide the paint at all. He is showing the brushstrokes. He's showing how he puts the paint on. He even paint with, uh, they even paint with, palette knives and things like that. This painting was shown alongside Impression Sunrise in the 64. This one here. These two pieces were shown together. I've gotten to see them in person, and they're really pretty amazing. It's funny because this one actually, Sunrise, is like thin paint in some places, right? Over here, it's very thin. Still very cool. In any case, Monet, he does lots of stuff. There's some other recipes they do kind of in terms of like making challenges for themselves. They go paint, Monet paints these haystacks. He paints them throughout the year, different times of year, different times of day, different weather, right? But always the same haystacks. He goes out, paints them that day, and then that's it. Again, it's like a painting a day sort of stuff. Here's a little bit tighter version of Monet doing ripples and things like that, or ripples on water and reflection. And again, it's super loose, but still it looks just like ripples, ripples of water. In any case, another thing he does too is he'll go out and paint the same subject, but limit his color palette. He'll say, I'm only taking the white, black, and purple today. I'm only taking the yellow and blue and black and white today. I'm only taking the red and green today. I'm only taking these colors today, right? And doing the same subject with only a limited number of colors of paint also lends to new ways of showing perspective, new ways of looking at things. So that's pretty cool. He, of course, late in his life, he builds this studio, this like glass studio on a bridge overlooking his lily pond, and he paints these very famous pieces of his lily pond that we all really know well. And again, the reflections of the sky, the really loose painterly lilies and stuff, lily pads. It's just an amazing depiction of Impressionist work. Now, some other artists, Renoir. This is beginning in 73. He begins painting kind of quick scenes of like public events. We've looked at his work before. People having lunch, people dancing, the sun cutting through leaves as a person walks by, the way that it hits their hat. And again, it's sort of loose. It can't be tight because these people aren't standing still. They're moving quickly, and he's just capturing a version of them that's very quick and brief. There's a lot of interplay of like how the people are relating, but there's not a lot of there may be drama in ways in the way that the people are relating, but there's not a big backstory. Now, of course, Renoir in 83, he realizes he can't paint. He reaches the end of Impressionism, realizes he doesn't know how to paint, and then he suddenly develops, he wants to learn how to paint well, and he decides, I want to paint a woman's bottom, so I want to touch it, then I know it's finished. Kind of a weird, creepy way of transitioning, but he does change his style. It becomes a little more classical, but it's actually it's pretty interesting in some ways, the way the classical meets his Impressionism. Now, Degas, he famously painted, the night scenes, the after bar, the morning after scenes of Paris streets, but, those were very loose, and the people always look very tired and beat up because of the grayness, the greenness. But he also did the painters. He did, or not the painters, the dancers. He did the dancers kind of moving through their studio, and again, these would be scenes where they're moving, they're not posing. And so he's just looking quickly and drawing them. He did these pastel drawings of bathers, and just sort of quickly painting them with the powdery pigments of oil and pastel, like dry pastel pigments. Pretty cool. I don't know. It's sort of loose. Again, very impressionist. Berthe Morisot, she's known for painting kind of fun outdoor leisure activity. Lots of women at leisure, watching kids, taking kids out to the beach and things like that. She is a good example of a term we need to know, although we've already talked about it. Painting in the open air like this is actually called plein air or open air painting. It's a style. It's just when you actually make it outside, out of doors, right? You're painting outdoors, right? That's plein air. Taking it out, setting up your easel in front of the pond and all that stuff. Like we said, it's already a thing. But Berthe Morisot, very good at doing this, these seaside scenes. Now, Post-Impressionism is an answer to Impressionism. I'm going to try to get through it, and hopefully my video doesn't cut out. But Post-Impressionism is a term applied to the more French artists or other artists living in France from 1885 to 1905. They're an answer to, or they're a follow-up to Impressionism. Although all painted in highly personal styles, they were united in rejecting the absence of form characteristic of impression. They built on the work of the Impressionists, but sought to give it more form, to be more exact, a little less loose, and give it more expression in emotionality or spirituality, to express it emotionally or spiritually. They just wanted to give more psychological depth, I guess, to the Impressionists. Impressionists was really all about that. There's nothing more there, right? Just this vision of the moment. But of course, it includes Van Gogh, Cézanne, Gauguin, and Seurat. They are the Post-Impressionists. Now, looking at Van Gogh, he's of course the most famous Post-Impressionist. It's all about psychology, right? It's very clear that Van Gogh had more. We talked about the meaning of Even Starry Night, this idea of his mother died, and when people die, they pass into the sky. It's spirits looking down on the world. We have the portraits of him, at different stages of his life. He cuts off his ear in a moment of self-harm. I've heard lots of stories behind it, but at the end of the day, it's really just about self-harm. And in relation to his work, he was broadly not liked. He was not accepted. People didn't like how loose and kind of kooky the work was. The perspective is disconcerting, right? All the rooms look like they're shrinking as you move back. The colors are like almost sickly or sickening to me. I don't know. Everything is yellow. It said he lived in this yellow house that potentially had lots of paint and chemicals, like lead in the paint and chemicals and things that may have attributed to a worsening of his mental state. But he was in and out of mental hospitals for most of his life. And the psychological effect on the art is very moving, although I've read some letters that he wrote to his brother Theo. There's a movie, Eternity's Gate, something like that. I haven't seen it, but I know the story of Van Gogh is very sad, and he ends up shooting himself and dying very slowly. It's a tragic story of a man who's sick, but the mental state leads to these depictions of things in a psychological manner to his Impressionism. I mean, he's really just doing Impressionist painting, but his way of doing it is so moving. It's very painterly. We see the paint. It's not hiding the paint at all. It's bright colors smack on top of each other. I would say this is not the subtleness that we see in other, the subtle like smoothing out of paint that we see in some of the other Post-Impressionists. This is very Impressionist. But yeah, Van Gogh's famous last words to his brother Theo is, "The sadness will last forever." It's a crazy story. It's a sad story just about, I don't know. Again, I would say he's really just an Impressionist, but his psychological state turned it into Post-Impressionism, right? Because it's so emotional in its depiction. In any case, Gauguin is another Post-Impressionist painter. He's famous for doing these sort of like kind of angular figures. He did this painting. He's actually most famous for leaving his wife and child in Europe and just running away to Tahiti because he couldn't stand not being an artist anymore. And then he wrote this tweet that looks like it's, or he wrote this phrase that looks like a tweet from like a modern politician. I'm a great artist, and I know it because of what I am, that I endured so much suffering so as to pursue my vocation. Otherwise, I would consider myself a rogue. Anyway, he has these portraits of himself in front of his paintings, and the paintings are very overwrought. There's some discussion of like some fear of the female entity, female identity, right? And he write this whole painting is about the story of like going from an infant, to a child, to prepubescent teenage years, and then becoming a woman, and all the stages of life for a woman, but in depicted in this way of like looking at these Tahitian women. And again, I don't know, lots of people start pointing out how angular and sort of exaggerated some of the female figures are in the post-impressionists. There are discussions of the psychological interpretation of what these men might have thought of the women they were painting. There are, of course, female impressionists and post-impressionists, but that's just a trend we start to see. I'll bring it back later when we talk about Picasso. But in any case, Cézanne has a big effect on Gauguin. Picasso actually said Cézanne is the father of all the expressionists. But Cézanne had this very calculated way of doing post-impressionism. I'd say it's a little less psychological, more organizational. The colors are a little smoother, although they're still very bold. They're smoother than the impressionists, right? He's trying to show a little bit more of what it's a surface that he's creating. It's not just paint that's left. I wouldn't call it naturalistic, but it is smoother. Now, yeah, and it's very angular. It's very geometric. That's important for some of what comes after post-impressionism. Just the way he used a knife to just I think he's the one who would use a knife mostly to just spread the paint in a very angular fashion, very geometric. He has these, psychological depictions of men as well, men at leisure, men at work. In any case, Seurat, another one. He actually is really well known for the pointillism and the stippling. I guess pointillism is he would basically do all of his brush strokes as tiny little points of different colors, and it was just layering and layering of thousands, if not millions, of little dots of color that, again, when we step back, all those dots optically mix together, and if you put red and green next to each other, they become brown. If you put blue and red next to each other, it becomes purple, rather than always mixing purple, although there is purple. But yeah, it's just all about the way that this layering of dots builds up. It's very post-impressionist. And then to do it in the fashion of like depicting scenes of leisure of the aristocracy. There's a scene of some dancers changing, or theater performers changing in front of one of his paintings. Some circus performers, big on circus performers, and sort of just like surreal in nature and sort of fantastical. But in any case, let me look real quick. Yeah, I think I need to go ahead and end there. We're looking at bridging the gap to America. I need to go faster in the second half. But yeah, that kind of rounds out up to post-impressionism in chapter 21 in the modern world. And we'll wrap it up in a part 2 video very soon. Thank you.